And I mentioned last week that as Malachi closes, basically the Old Testament closes with the promise that the promise of Elijah coming, and that's in chapter 4 of Malachi and verse 5. And that's how the Old Testament ends. And so the last thing the people of Israel had before the coming of Christ was, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the coming of the great and dreadful day of the Lord. And we go into the New Testament, we see that Jesus says that John the Baptist is that Elijah. He says that's who Malachi was talking about. And you can find that in Matthew 11. And these are, I think we hit these last week, but just real quickly get back where we were. Matthew 11:14. Jesus said, and if you will receive it, this is Elias which was for to come. And that's talking about John in verse 13. For all the prophets in the law prophesied until John. And if you'll receive it, this is Elias which was for to come. So the Lord says that the Elijah, or Elias, is the Greek form of it in the New Testament. Elias, when you're looking for Elias to come, who's to be the forerunner of Messiah, John is him. And Jesus said that pretty clear. And you see it in Matthew 17. He says it again in verse 12, Matthew 17:12. But I say unto you that Elias is come already, and they knew him not, but have done unto him whatsoever they listed. Likewise shall also the Son of Man suffer them. Then the disciples understood that he spake unto them of John the Baptist. So the Lord's pretty clear in that this Elijah the prophet that the Old Testament spoke of coming back, it's that spirit of Elijah. And it was John the Baptist was the man, and I'm just going to go with Jesus on that and say that Elijah came, but he came, it was the spirit of Elijah in John the Baptist. And that's what Jesus said in Matthew 11, Matthew 17. You see it in Luke 1 as well. But following Malachi, when the Old Testament is closed up, there's 400 years of time where we don't have any prophets prophesying to the people. We don't have God speaking to people in any particular message or way. And so what was happening during that, they have the promise of the coming of Messiah in Malachi 4:2. The Son of Righteousness will come. The Son of Righteousness will arise with healing in His wings. Elijah the prophet is coming, and he's going to turn the heart of the fathers to the children. And so you have those two main promises at the end of the Old Testament. Then we get to the New Testament. Of course, we see those things coming to be. But between the two testaments, the Old Testament, New Testament, historically what was happening. Because you come into the New Testament and you start seeing some things you haven't seen before. If you've read through the Old Testament and then you get to the New Testament, there's some things there that we've not, that you don't even see in the Old Testament. You had these political groups, you have the Pharisees, the Sadducees, you have these different groups of people. And where did they come from? Because they weren't there in the Old Testament. So during that 400 years of time, these things kind of came to be, and we see them in the New Testament, the days of Christ. And so that's what we'll be looking at this morning. I'll give you a little bit of a history and kind of explain a little bit about where these groups and things come from, hopefully. And then that way when we get into the New Testament, you see them, we know where they came from that way. So I believe it'll be a help to do that. So during this 400 years of time, when the Old Testament ends, Israel is under the rule of Persia. Remember, this is going to be during the time of Esther, following the days of Ezra and Nehemiah. That's kind of the time frame when the Old Testament ends. So Persia is in control. Well, we get to the New Testament. Who's in control? It's the Romans, isn't it? And so how did this come about? Where did they come from? In about 333 BC, Alexander the Great, we've probably heard of that fella. Alexander the Great comes in, he conquers the Persians, and he basically builds at that time, the largest empire the world had ever seen. And he does so before he's even 30 years old. But he doesn't last very long. His empire is large and expands fast, but he eventually dies, and after he dies, during his time, the Jews are under the control or under the authority of Alexander the Great, who is this Grecian Macedonian empire. And so that's the major world power between the two testaments. You had Persia, who was in control of everything. At the end of the Old Testament, you have Greece or Macedonia, who kind of takes over things in between there, and we don't have a lot of Bible history of that. But then in the New Testament, we come in and Rome has taken over. After Alexander the Great died at a young age, he had 5 top generals who kind of divided his territory. And this one took parts down the lower parts of Egypt and that area. Some took Asia Minor, another one more in European area. And so they divided out Alexander's territory, and each one of them had a certain piece of it. Well, it didn't take long. They started fighting among themselves. And one of those men were killed, and it left 4 major areas controlled by these former men who lived and fought under Alexander the Great. And we know their names. It was Seleucus, Lysimachus, Ptolemy, and Cassander. And Antigonus was the one who was killed. Okay, now, why did I say that? Well, we've probably never heard of these people. But the Bible speaks of them before they come onto the scene. If you go back to Daniel chapter 8, during this time of silence, when we don't have any prophecies coming or any word from God coming, we cannot assume or think that God isn't at work. And so if you go back to Daniel chapter 8, Daniel had foretold of this. You have Alexander, this great power that was swift and fast and took over everything. He dies suddenly, and he has 5 men come up, but one of those is killed pretty quickly by the others. And so it leaves 4 major, smaller empires, but they're still bigger powers, I guess you'd say. But Alexander's kingdom is basically divided into 4 after the death of that 5th one. So in Daniel 8 and verse number 8, Daniel sees this vision of this ram pushing westward, and verse 4, and then this he-goat came from the west on the face of the whole earth and touched not the ground, and the goat had a notable horn between his eyes. Verse number 5. Verse number 6 of Daniel 8, he came to the ram that had 2 horns, and I'll just tell you beforehand, we get to that. He explains this later on in the chapter, but later in the chapter we'll find out that ram with 2 horns, that's that Median Persian empire. It's kind of a dual empire. The Medes and Persians, that's the 2 horns of the ram that's pushing westward. They came from the east. I'm backwards to you. They came from the east pushing westward, and then you have Alexander, and that's going to be this he-goat with the notable horn that's pushing against that ram. And they're against each other. So that's what God is doing through Daniel. He's describing events that are going to take place even after the Old Testament closes out and before Christ comes. And that is, there's going to be this great empire, this ram with 2 horns. That's the Medes and Persians. And then there's going to be this other empire that comes from the west with a notable horn. And it's going to take over that empire, but that empire is going to be dissolved. Verse number 8. Therefore the he-goat waxed very great, and when he was strong, the great horn was broken, and for it came up 4 notable ones. Now that's what I just said. That's history. The notable horn, Alexander the Great, when he was strong, he was broken. When the empire was really doing well, but he died suddenly. But then after him came up 4 notable horns, which would be the 4 leaders, toward the 4 winds of heaven. So Alexander's kingdom was divided into 4, basically north, south, east, and west. And there was a 5th initially, but he was killed off by the others and his property taken. There were 4 major ones who came up after Alexander. And out of one of them came forth a little horn. And one of those kingdoms became a little more powerful than the others. And he waxed exceeding great toward the south and toward the east and toward the pleasant land. Now he's describing this man who would rule over the land of Israel during that time. And this is probably talking about a man named Antiochus IV. But it waxed great, verse 10, even to the host of heaven, and it cast down some of the host and of the stars to the ground and stamped upon them. Now typically when you read in prophecy of the stars falling from heaven and the host of the stars being cast to the ground, that's talking about that Jewish hierarchy. And this Antiochus comes in and he desecrates the temple, and he sacrifices a pig in the temple of God in Israel. And you talk about an abominable thing, that's what that was. And so he's kind of what's the word? He's ridding he's kind of running out the priesthood of the temple, and that's what I believe he's talking about here. He cast down some of the host and of the stars to the ground. By him the daily sacrifice was taken away in verse 11, and the place of his sanctuary was cast down. Then you get down to verse number 20, you see that God explains what this is. Well, during this time, this history of Daniel 8 here, it tells us everything that's going on from the end of Malachi to the beginning of Matthew. So if you back up, just one thing I'll mention, because this will come up in a little while, in verse 14. And he said unto me, unto 2,300 days, then shall the sanctuary be cleansed. So this Antiochus comes in, sacrifices a pig in the temple. I mean, just an abomination in bringing uncleanness in the temple. And then after a time, he says, the temple's going to be cleansed. And verse 14, that he says that the sanctuary will be cleansed. And this is going to lead to what we now call Hanukkah, is what that is. And the Jews still observe that, but and we'll see that that's in the Bible too. But you get down to verse 20. The ram which thou sawest having 2 horns are the kings of Media and Persia. So see, it's pretty simple. And some people take this Daniel 8 and they say, well, that's something that's not yet happened. That's going to be something in the future. You've got all these struggles going on over there, and this little horn in verse 9, that's the Antichrist. But he explains it in the last part of the chapter and says those 2 horns are the Medes and Persians. And the rough goat in verse 21 is the king of Grecia. And the great horn that is between his eyes is the first king. Well, that's the Greek Empire and Alexander the Great. And that being broken, whereas 4 stood up for it, 4 kingdoms shall stand up out of that nation, and not in his power. Well, that's exactly what happened. Following the death of Alexander, there were 5 initially. 1 is killed by the other 4, and those 4 kingdoms rise up, but they're never as great as the original kingdom. And so we have no Bible record of these things happening, but we have a Bible prophecy saying that they would happen, and when we go back through history, we know that they did. and that was between the Old and New Testaments. And so they were, during that time, and back in Daniel 8, I read that verse 14, that the temple would be, the sanctuary would be cleansed. Now, during that time, after that Antiochus Epiphanes is one name he goes by, this is about 175 years before Christ. He hated the Jews, and he wanted to get rid of all the Jews and all of the Jewish religion, and he forbade circumcision. He ordered that all copies of the law be burned. He sacrificed that pig in the temple and all these things. And these people, he had these men going around from town to town forcing people really to offer sacrifices to Zeus. And an old priest named Mattathias stood up and he refused. And he says, I'm not going to do it. I am not going to worship this false god. But this younger priest did. And Mattathias, being angry at this young man for submitting to this false worship and denying God essentially, he's angered in it, and he kills that Jew, and he kills the man that showed up to compel him to do it. And then he takes off. And this begins a great rebellion. You've heard about like the American Revolution. You have like the shot heard round the world. That's kind of a term we've heard, right? Well, this was the shot that was fired that started a revolt against the reign of Antiochus. This was the shot that was fired. He'd come in, they says, you're going to sacrifice to Zeus. This old priest says, no, I'm not. And this young one does. And the old priest says, listen here, I'm going to take care of both of you. He kills them. He takes off, and his son leads this revolt, and his name is Judas. He's his third son of Mattathias, that old priest. His name is Judas, and his nickname is the Hammer. That'd be some kind of nickname, wouldn't it? The Hammer. And he come through, and he was able to lead a rebellion, and they regained control of Jerusalem. And in doing so, that's when they went in, they cleansed the temple like Daniel said they would. And that became known as what we call Hanukkah. It's the Feast of Dedication, and it's found in the Bible in John chapter 10, I believe it is. John 10. And Jesus was present at that feast in His day. John chapter 10, sometimes people question what is Hanukkah? Well, that's what it is. Hanukkah is an observance that remembers the cleansing of the temple after the desecration of it by this man about 175 years before Christ. And that's what it's for. It's called the Feast of the Dedication in John 10, verse 22. And it was at Jerusalem, the Feast of the Dedication, and it was winter. And Jesus walked in the temple in Solomon's porch. So Jesus was there during this Feast of Hanukkah, and there were people everywhere. And so Jesus goes down to the temple, and He's teaching down there. So Jesus didn't shy away from this feast, but he observed it as a Jew would, the cleansing of the temple. And eventually, though, Rome comes into power, Rome comes in, and under Roman rule, the Jews were forced to pay high taxes, but they were allowed to maintain their religious practice. And a man named Herod, who was not really a king, though he called himself a king, and you're probably familiar with that fella. A man named Herod, who was in cahoots with the Romans, but he really wasn't even a Jew, but he claimed to be a Jew, and it's kind of a mess there, the Herodian family. But he gets Rome to appoint him as the king over Jerusalem, over Israel. And he's not really a king. He likes to call himself a king, but he's more of a governor under Roman authority. Does that make sense? But he says he's the king of the Jews, basically, and he's called in the Bible Herod the king. King Herod, we call him. But he was able to maintain some peace, and his job was to keep the Jews from rebelling against Rome like they had against Antiochus 100 years before, 175 years before, 150 years before. And so that was Herod's role. Herod was an appointed king by Rome who was to oversee Israel and to keep them quiet. Give them what they want, pacify them, get our taxes from them, and you just keep the peace down there and keep them from trying to raise up some form of rebellion. That was Herod's role, and that whole Herodian family. That was their job, and that's what they were in it for. It was a political thing, he was not a king by right. He was not of any Davidic line or anything like that. He was an appointed man over Israel who held the title of king, but his job was just to keep the people at bay, to keep them from turning against Rome. And so that's where we are when we come into the New Testament. Now, of course, Herod was a cruel man, and we've seen some of the things that was done when Jesus was born. He slaughtered those infants in Bethlehem. Remember that? And he was a cruel man, but at times he did good enough for the people that they kind of just stayed and kept to their own selves. Does that make sense? He was a mean fella, and he ruled horribly, but he did enough to keep the Jews to keep them at bay against Rome, as much as they hated Rome. And so he did his job. That was what Rome had him for. So as from Rome's perspective, he did a decent job. From man's perspective and from God's perspective, he was a wicked man. But he did what Rome had basically hired him to do, and that was just keep those Jews from raising up some form of rebellion or anything. But we get to the New Testament, and so there's kind of a little history and just a basic understanding of what went on between the end of Malachi and the beginning of Matthew. You had the Persians were in control. Alexander the Great comes in, and he takes out that Persian Empire, and he becomes the world empire, the Macedonian Greek Empire. And then he dies suddenly, and then these four generals of his, these four men, come up under him, and they establish four separate, smaller kingdoms. And then Rome is able to defeat those later on. And Israel restores their religious practice. The temple is cleansed from the abominable acts of Antiochus. And that becomes Hanukkah, that feast of Hanukkah that's observed every year about our Christmas time that we know of. And then we come into the New Testament, we see those things going on. That Feast of Dedication, we see that in Matthew, or in John, and we know what that is now, right? Because we've kind of seen some of that history. But none of this was a surprise because Daniel told us it was going to happen. Or God, through Daniel, God told Daniel it was going to happen. And so something else that we run into in the New Testament are these different groups of people that didn't exist in the Old Testament. We have, in the New Testament, we have the scribes. Now, in the Old Testament, we don't have this group of people. There were some scribes in the Old Testament. Generally, the scribes of the Old Testament were responsible and accountable to the king. The king had his own scribes, and their job was basically recording the history of the king and those things. And we read over in the Old Testament that which was written in the books of the kings. That's what the scribes' duties were in the Old Testament. In the New Testament, we have this group of scribes who are responsible for a lot more. They're often found in a religious setting. You have the scribes and Pharisees. They seem to always be together, don't they, when you read about them. And so their job was, and they kind of go back to the time of Ezra, because Ezra was a priest and a scribe. And in the days of Ezra, these priests began kind of restoring that original responsibility of maintaining the purity of the law and that type of thing. And so these scribes were basically professional students who set themselves apart and says, I'm going to study the Scriptures and teach the Scriptures. They were professional Bible teachers when we read about the scribes in the New Testament. In Matthew 22, so we come into the Gospels, we got some new things we haven't seen before. If you come through the Old Testament and then all of a sudden you get into the New Testament, you have these new things, and the scribes is one of those things. Matthew 22 and verse 35, these men are called something else. They're scribes. I'm in 23. 22 and verse 35. Then one of them, which was a lawyer, asked him a question, tempting him. Now that's another word that was used for these scribes, this professional teachers of the law. He was a lawyer. And on our day, a lawyer, we think about courtrooms and that type of thing, and legal documents and that type of thing. But the lawyer in that day was the religious scribe whose responsibility was to study the Scriptures and to teach people the Scriptures. And they're called lawyers, they're called scribes, and they're also called in Luke 5, they're given another name. Luke chapter 5 and verse 17. And it came to pass on a certain day as he was teaching that there were Pharisees and doctors of the law sitting by. That's another term, that's another name given to these scribes. They were called scribes, they were called lawyers, and they were called doctors of the law. And this new group, and these come from, they kind of trace back to the time of Ezra, when those captives come back from Babylon. You have these men, and really they opposed Christ. In the days of the Lord, they opposed Christ, and Jesus denounced them because he says they've made the Scriptures of no effect. By their traditions, these Pharisees and scribes, by their traditions, they've made the Scriptures of no effect. And so these scribes, they're closely knit. You see them alongside those Pharisees. We just saw that in Luke 5:17, but you see that pretty regularly. It's the scribes and Pharisees, kind of always lumped together. And then that's the Pharisees. That's another group we haven't seen before. If we come through the Old Testament, we come into the Gospels, we start seeing the Pharisees. Well, who are these people? Where did they come from? They came about during that time of the Maccabees, that rebellion I talked about, that Judas Maccabeus, the hammer, when he was kind of leading that rebellion and winning back Jerusalem. These Pharisees came about that time, and they initially were called separatists. And they came to take the title Pharisee later on, but they were really not a political party. They intended to be and claimed to be devout keepers and protectors of the law. And that's why they're always with those scribes. You have the scribes, they're studying. The Pharisees, they may have other jobs and responsibilities, but they're dedicated, they're devout, and they spend a lot of time with those scribes who are their teachers. Kind of thing. And so they have the Pharisees. They were supposedly devout, religious, weren't involved as much in politics, but their focus supposedly was in keeping the law and maintaining the purity of the law along with those scribes, and that's why they're always kind of together. But then you have the Sadducees. And they're always kind of mentioned alongside as the Pharisees as well, but they were in opposition. The Sadducees and Pharisees didn't get along. They were opposite of the Pharisees. While the Pharisees were the strict, religious, devout keepers of the law, the Sadducees were the liberals. They were the ones who they didn't believe in the existence of spirits. They didn't believe in the resurrection of the dead. They didn't believe in those things. They were kind of a smaller group, but they held more power. in Jesus' day, the high priesthood went to someone who was a Sadducee. When you read about the high priest in Jesus' day, those were Sadducees because they kind of had the, what's the word there? They had the monopoly. They kind of, by strong arm and tactic, kind of strong arm tactics, I guess you'd say, a lot like our modern politics. They were just politicians, and they were after power and authority, those Sadducees. They kept the high priesthood. They were the leaders of the Sanhedrin. They maintained those high positions. The Pharisees were more about religion, and we're going to maintain purity and be devout. The Sadducees were, we're going to rule the people. We're going to be the leaders in this thing. We want the high seats. We want the high places. And they too, of course, also opposed Christ. The Pharisees opposed Christ because He called them hypocrites, and they were. The Sadducees opposed Christ because they didn't even believe in the things that Jesus claimed, Jesus preached. And they had a strong hold on the priesthood. Now, there's another group that's in there called the Herodians. We hear of them occasionally. They opposed Christ because they saw Christ as revolutionary. And back to that Herod, that King Herod, the Herodians were those. This was a political group, and they were aligned with Herod and that Herodian family. And so anyone who kind of rose up against Rome, those Herodians would go against him. And they viewed Jesus as one who was opposed to Rome. And he's going to start trouble. We better do something about this guy because he's going to start some trouble. He's going to raise a rebellion against Rome. And we're here to keep the peace. We need to keep things quiet. Rome's going to protect us and take care of us. Just give them what they want, and they're going to take care of us. That sounds like a modern Democrat, doesn't it? You just give us your tax money and we'll take care of you. And that's the way the Herodians kind of were. They weren't religious at all. But they supported Herod. They supported being tied to Rome because they viewed Rome as their protector. They saw the government as the ones who would take care of them if they had troubles. And so they were opposed to Christ because they believed Jesus was basically against Rome. And in Mark chapter 3, you see them, they're willing to kill Him. They want to kill Jesus. The Pharisees alongside the Herodians. In Mark 3:6, the Pharisees went forth and straightway took counsel with the Herodians against Him, how they might destroy Him. They were these groups who weren't necessarily in agreement at any other time, but they all agreed, we got to do something about this Jesus fella. The Sadducees, the Pharisees, the Herodians. You also have another group that you occasionally read of in the New Testament, and that is these called zealots. These were those who were basically opposite the Herodians. These were a more political group. They were pretty fanatic and extreme, but they were kind of like little terrorists. They were always trying to, they would engage in violence against Roman authorities. They would oppose anything that came against Jewish religion or even Jewish kind of heritage and the whole idea of what a Jew is to them. Acts chapter 5. Acts chapter 5, you'll see in verse 36. Acts 5:36, for before these days rose up Theudas, boasting himself to be somebody, to whom a number of men, about 400, joined themselves, who was slain, and all as many as obeyed him were scattered and brought to naught. After this man rose up Judas of Galilee in the days of the taxing, and drew away much people after him. he also perished, and all, even as many as obeyed him, were dispersed. And so these were some of those zealot groups. You have this man named Theudas. He rises up against the Roman government. He's kind of trying to start something, and they go against him. Another man named Judas who comes up during this taxing, and they're opposed to taxation. They're opposed to Roman rule. They're opposed to all that Rome is enforcing. And so they were always just at odds and trying to start trouble with Rome. And that's the zealots. And if you remember, a man named Simon became one of the apostles who was a member of this group. Simon Zelotes, and that's what that means. He was one of the zealots. He was a man who had been involved in some of this. We would probably say terrorism. It's just opposing the government. You know, these guys, if they had access to some sort of bomb or something, they'd be the guys that drive a truck up to the government building and blow it up. That's the type of guys these were. They'd catch a few Roman soldiers out partying or something. They'd gang and whip them up and kill them and drag them out and leave them for dead. They were just an extreme fanatical group who claimed to be defending Israel. They claimed to be staunch defenders of Israel, though they were very extreme in what they were doing. And Simon, of course, one of them at least, and I'd imagine others of them, were saved through Christ. And Simon was one of them. We have in the New Testament, we have this group called the Sanhedrin. We haven't heard of them before in the Old Testament. And in the New Testament era, the leader of the Sanhedrin was the high priest. And like I said, the high priest was always a Sadducee. And this really don't have a lot of history on how this came about, but this was basically the Supreme Court of Israel. There were 70 of them, and the high priest was the leader of them. Rome had given this Sanhedrin the right to pass judgment of death, but not the right to execute it. And that's why you have Jesus being tried. Jesus is tried at that Sanhedrin court. They bring him to the high priest. They go to the high priest's house in the middle of the night, remember? And bring Jesus there. And then he stands before that court. Peter's standing outside, denying him to that little maid, remember? And Jesus is before that Sanhedrin. Then they come out and they say, then they take him to Pilate. Remember, that's why. Because, okay, we want to kill this man, but they won't let us kill him, so we got to present him to them so that they can do the execution. They pass judgment of death, and so they bring him before the people. What should I do with this man? They say, crucify him, crucify him. And so you got these Sadducees and these men who heavily influence the people. They're out there coaching these people. Look, we got to get rid of this man. Kill this man. Crucify this man. And Pilate brings him out and says, what are we going to do with him? They say, crucify him. Why? Because it's this plot that's after Jesus. The Pharisees, the Herodians, the Sadducees, the scribes, all of them are against him, and they're all in cahoots, and they can't do what they want to do because Rome has a hold on them, and so they convince Rome that he's worthy of death, and Rome executes him. And so these are things that come to be, but we didn't know, if we didn't know some of this history between the Old and New Testament, we wouldn't know where these things came from. We also have, that comes up in the New Testament, the synagogues. There are no synagogues in the Old Testament. You ever think of that? Where did they come from? Well, during that time of Babylonian captivity, remember these Jews, Jerusalem was destroyed, the Jews were taken captive into Babylon, scattered throughout Babylon. Well, they had to find somewhere to worship. They didn't have a temple, and they couldn't offer sacrifices at the temple, but they could get together in small groups, and they could worship God and sing some hymns and those type of things together, and that's what led to the synagogue assembly. And then when we come into the New Testament, you see a synagogue in every little town. When Paul goes around preaching, there are synagogues. Everywhere there's a group of Jews, there's a synagogue that they can attend and they can observe at least a form of worship. And really that's where what we get, where the church model, the local church model comes from that New Testament synagogue model. And there's a lot of things that are carried over from that synagogue into what we're doing even right now. In that I'm standing here teaching from the Bible. And that's what the synagogue was. They would have one who was kind of the head of the synagogue, and they had a few scrolls, a few portions of Scripture, and they'd read those Scriptures, and somebody would teach from them. And we see Jesus doing that. He goes into the synagogue, remember, and he reads Isaiah, that first preaching message we have recorded of Jesus. He's in the synagogue, and he stands up to read, and he reads Isaiah, and he says, "This day is this Scripture fulfilled in your ears." Where'd that synagogue come from? Well, that come from that Babylonian captivity we read all about all through the Old Testament that was spoken of. That's where they were started. And that way they were able to maintain and keep a knowledge of the law during that time of captivity. And another thing is, you get to the New Testament, you see those, remember the wise men who came from the east? It says, we've come to see him who's born King of the Jews. We've seen his star in the east. We've come to worship him as King of the Jews. How did they know that? How did these men from the far east even know anything about a star and a king who is going to be born in Israel? Because of the days of the captivity, these captives, through their synagogue, establishing these individual synagogues, the Scriptures were carried with them into Babylon. These years and years and years later, these Babylonian astrologers, I think is probably the better word. They call them magicians. I don't think we'd go that far in our understanding. But these men had the Scriptures of Daniel. They had the Scriptures of some of these Old Testament prophets prior to the destruction of Jerusalem. They had those Scriptures, and they looked back through those Scriptures, and they said, look, there's going to be a king born. And the Bible talks about Numbers, talks about a star. Well, they see this star, and it's over Israel, and they go, well, the king, we go to the capital, we go to Jerusalem. Well, what are you talking about, a king? And remember Herod, he goes to his men, and his men tell him that he's to be born in Bethlehem. How did they know he was going to be born in Bethlehem? The Scriptures told them. And so, even though God wasn't outrightly speaking to men during this 400-year time period, God was still working. And you look at all that had to happen, Alexander the Great coming in, the Romans coming in, this Herodian group, these Pharisees, these Sadducees, these scribes, Jesus coming onto the scene, denouncing all of them. You have this worry about rebellion against Rome, these Herodians, and you have these zealots who are wanting to rebel against Rome. And so there's always this guardianship that says, look, we got to keep these people quiet, we got to keep these people calm. And when Jesus comes on, he wrecks the whole thing, doesn't he? In their minds. And they killed him. And then when you get to Acts, you see Peter preaching, you have killed the Prince of Life. And so all through this time, God is preparing the world for the coming of Christ. God is preparing the world for the coming of the Messiah, for the spread of the gospel. Imagine what the influence the Greeks had on the world. And you think of the Greeks, you think of their culture, their philosophy, their deep thinking, their reasoning, all these things that go along with that Greek culture. That's what the whole world was saturated with, that idea. And they were fascinated by these Greek sculptures and Greek art and all these things. And then the Romans come in and they make it possible. You have people who start thinking about things. And you've got the whole world is looking around and saying, well, wonder how'd all this come to be? And these philosophers would just sit down. They'd say, well, how did we get here? That comes from Greek thought and Greek influence. Then Rome comes along and says, we're going to make it easy for you to go from here to there. We're going to build these roads. We're going to make, and everything. Remember, the term, all roads lead to Rome, don't they? And so they're giving access for you and me to go and to come and to go and to travel. And they're making that possible. So when Christ comes, He dies. These apostles are told to go into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature. What has God already done? He's already paved the way for it to be possible. He has people over in Athens. He has people over in Thessalonica. He has these people all over the world who are sitting thinking, because of Greek influence, they're thinking, how did we get here? What is the purpose of life? And when Jesus sends those men to go preach the gospel, He says, I've paved the way. I've given you roads. There are ships. There are boats traveling. There are ways of travel. There are means of getting into the world much better than ever before. And now you go and take my message to the world. And even though there was a lot of terrible things that happened during this time, God was preparing the world to receive the gospel. And they weren't without the Scriptures during that time either. You get to Galatians chapter 4. We'll have one more verse of Scripture here. Galatians 4. Galatians 4 and verse 4. But when the fullness of the time was come, God sent forth His Son, made of a woman, made under the law, to redeem them that were under the law, that we might receive the adoption of sons. But when the fullness of the time was come, what does that mean? Well, God had foretold when Christ would be born through Daniel. He said it's going to be 490 years until the coming of Christ. When the fullness of that time was come, when the time had come for it to happen, just like God said, then God sent forth His Son. The Bible is a marvelous and a wonderful book, isn't it? And if people could just see it for what it really is. But even when God is silent, He's not out of control. He's still overseeing all that's going on in Israel and in all the world to prepare the world for the spread of the gospel in the days following the resurrection of Christ and the days of those apostles. And even today, it's gotten even more so. You think about our ability to get the gospel out compared to theirs. And the Bible says that the gospel was preached in all the world in that day. They were going everywhere. And so I certainly think we're without excuse, aren't we? As much as God has given us and much as God has worked and made it possible for us to travel and to move and to get the gospel out, God has made a way for us. He's paved the way, and He's made it easy for us if we would do it. Right? Any questions? Quite a mouthful, I think, this morning, but if anything comes to mind. All right. Well,